and methane action go hand in hand. My name is Dave Keating. I'm going to be guiding us through tonight's talk, and welcome to all of you here in the room with us and also to those of you joining online. Now, today we're going to be talking about methane's role in climate change, and in particular, the proposal put forward by the European Commission 1 year ago for the first EU-wide legislation to cut methane emissions. Since the proposal has come out, the file has stalled a bit in the European Parliament, and national governments haven't shown that much interest in the Council, with countries finding themselves preoccupied with all of the energy implications that we're dealing with right now. However, finally, it does look like we should be getting some preliminary approaches to this file from both institutions pretty soon. So today, we're going to talk about the regulation and the measures needed to reduce domestic and international methane emissions. We'll also talk about what's possible in the new energy context that we find ourselves in, given the Ukraine war and the Commission's RePowerEU plan in response. Now, this is going to be an interactive conversation, and you guys will also be able to participate. If you're here in the audience, you'll see you'll have a little slip of paper with a QR code on there. You can scan that to get onto Slido. That's how you're going to be able to ask your questions to the panelists today. If you're watching online, you can also see that field for asking Slido questions. During the panel discussions later on, I'll be keeping tabs on your questions, and I'll put them to the panelists. So, let's get started with some welcome remarks from Jonathan Banks, Global Director for Methane Pollution Prevention at the Clean Air Task Force. Jonathan?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Banks. I'm the Global Director for the Methane Program at the Clean Air Task Force. CATF's an international organization working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change, and methane mitigation is one of our oldest and largest programs that we have, seeking to catalyze deep global reductions in methane emissions to help stave off the risk of irreversible climate change. Tonight, thanks to our hosts at Euractiv, we will have a robust conversation about the current state of the EU Methane Regulation. Methane is, of course, 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period and responsible right now for about a half a degree of warming that we're feeling out of the roughly 1.2 degrees that the planet has warmed to date. Because of its potency and its short lifespan compared to carbon dioxide, cutting methane pollution is the fastest way to slow the escalating rate of global warming. Scientists agree that we will not be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, or honestly any target, if we don't drastically cut anthropogenic methane emissions. Yet, according to the UN, we are not reducing methane emissions, we're actually increasing them, and we're increasing at an alarming rate. Last year witnessed the highest ever recorded rise in methane emissions concentration in our atmosphere. In this decade, we will need to make significant progress cutting methane emissions across all three major methane-emitting sectors: energy, agriculture, and waste. But some of the biggest opportunities are in the energy sector, specifically the oil and gas sector, which will be the focus of our conversation tonight. The International Energy Agency estimates we can eliminate nearly 75% of the methane emissions in the oil and gas sector globally using tools and technologies that we have today. This is based on the average price, and these measures are all very economic, and many of them are profitable. This is, of course, based on the average price of gas from 2017 to 2021, which is merely a fraction of what we're seeing today. At today's prices, nearly everything that's technically feasible to cut can be done at a profit. Europe is, of course, facing an energy crisis and is desperately searching for new energy imports. Methane pollution in the energy sector is not just a climate problem, it's also a huge waste of energy that can be harnessed to help solve the current crisis. In RePowerEU, the Commission announced a program called You Collect, We Buy that could be harnessed to reduce the 210 BCM of gas that is wasted globally through flaring, venting, and fugitive emissions. Policymakers around the world are starting to respond to this. Methane took center stage at COP26, where the EU and the US jointly launched the Global Methane Pledge, an international call to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030, with 100 countries joining at COP26. Just recently, at COP27 in Egypt, the momentum on methane action increased substantially, with over 150 countries now supporting the pledge and nations responding with additional announcements to regulate methane emissions across different sectors. Now, 95% of NDCs include methane in their greenhouse gas target, or they will by their next update. More than 50 countries have national methane action plans or are working to create one. The EU joined other nations in a joint declaration between energy importers and exporters to work to reduce its methane emissions. And Canada, Nigeria, and the United States announced far-reaching regulations or regulatory pathways. These include ambitious new plans like monthly leak detection and repair inspections, LDAR, at all oil and gas facilities, replacing vent-by-design equipment within a few years, and a fee on methane emissions. Also, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, IMEO, which was launched by the EU and UNEP in 2021, announced a new initiative at COP27 called MARS, the Methane Alert and Response System, which is designed to accelerate implementation of the Global Methane Pledge by scaling up global efforts to detect and act on major emission sources, so-called super emitters. At COP27, I had the privilege to be the MC for the Methane Ministerial, where Executive Vice President Timmermans and Special Presidential Envoy John Kerry issued a call to action to all nations. Return to COP28 with all nations covering methane in their NDCs, methane action plans from all countries, and specific methane policies that start to slash methane emissions. The EU Methane Regulation is the EU's answer to this last part of the call to action. The original proposal builds on the Commission's international leadership to reduce methane emissions and seeks to address methane emissions from the energy sector in a comprehensive way. There are a lot of good elements in this proposal. MRV measures progressively becoming more granular, regular leak detection and repair, and requirements to address venting and flaring from oil and gas facilities. The regulations also address coal mine methane, but we won't do a whole lot of talking about that tonight. However, it's not enough for the EU to put forth good regulations, no matter what they look like from the beginning. We need globally leading regulations. We need regulations that recognize the evolution of the regulatory system that has been happening over the last few months. Recently, Canada announced a second round of regulatory actions that it's going to be taking that will end up being the strongest regulations in the world. They include monthly leak detection and repair, zero-emitting equipment standards, and annual inspections of non-producing wells, and aggressive standards for venting at all facilities. They've also expanded the scope of their regulations to cover the distribution system, which was uncovered by the Canadian regulations previously. For the EU's regulations to be seen as a global example of leadership, it must incorporate these kinds of forward-thinking policies and resist the efforts that are being exerted to weaken them. The EU should include requirements for monthly leak detection and repair, inspections across all facilities, and it should set into law the first comprehensive plan for import standards that takes into consideration the EU's entire methane footprint, where the vast majority of energy emissions take place outside its borders. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, who has, of course, been the champion of the European Green Deal, but he's also been a champion of methane mitigation globally. He has helped lead the efforts around the Global Methane Pledge, along with John Kerry, and your leadership on methane has really created real momentum, and I look forward to your remarks and welcome you up here to the podium. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm very glad to be here. I could keep my remarks extremely short by saying what he said, but I guess you want to hear it from me as well. So I'll do my best to deliver a few remarks. So if in the IPCC assessment we see that nearly 45% of current net warming is caused by methane, human-driven methane emissions, and that in 2021 the volume of methane in the atmosphere saw its largest annual increase ever recorded, we really need to act. There's also a silver lining to those shocking numbers. Methane is a greenhouse gas that we can do something about, as you've said, and we can do it quickly, and we can do it at a profit. And as a Dutchman, I'm always happy when we can do something at a profit. And it will have a positive impact on the warming in years and decades. It's also the cheapest and fastest way to slow down global warming in the years ahead. If we're serious about this, we can reduce the accelerating global warming by doing simple, proven things in agriculture, energy, and waste sectors. As you said, the technologies are there. It's not something we need to invent. And if we do these things, we will avoid, in our analysis, 0.2 degrees global warming between 2040 and 2070. So in the EU, we've taken steps to reduce our own methane emissions for almost 30 years already. Over the past 3 decades, we reduced these emissions from landfilling by almost half and fossil fuels by over 65%. But still, much more needs to be done on all fronts. Reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, and we want to go even further. We want to reach climate neutrality, will mean that all sectors of our economy have to make an effort to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The EU is taking this work very seriously, even while this has been a terrible year for us. Russia's brutal war on our continent has brought a humanitarian, an energy, and an economic crisis. And they were engineered because Putin wants to use energy to divide and weaken us. And he's trying to destroy Ukraine in such a way that millions of Ukrainians will have to flee the country. And he hopes that that will also exacerbate our problems and weaken us and make us go to our knees, which we will never do. And on top of all that, the madness of the situation is that tens of billions of cubic meters of methane are flared and vented into the atmosphere while there are energy crises in the world. Just imagine you could use that methane to solve some of these crises. It's an entirely preventable situation of economic loss coupled with climate destruction. And we've also seen it when the pipelines were destroyed, immediate increase of methane emissions. So the EU's methane regulation is at the heart of our effort to address avoidable emissions of methane in the energy sector. Our proposal would create obligations for fossil gas, oil and coal operators active in the EU to monitor, measure at source level and transparently report methane emissions of all their assets. It also contains obligations to do 3 things. First, regularly carry out surveys to detect and repair methane leaks across all components. Second, to stop avoidable venting and flaring of methane into the atmosphere. And third, maximize flaring efficiency in order to minimize losses of methane from flares. But we know that the largest methane emissions associated with the European economy are not happening within our borders. You've already signaled that in your intervention. Instead, they take place during the production and transport of fossil fuels that we import into the EU. So we've also been investing in technologies which will give us more live data. You've already mentioned them. And whenever we do something, I said this also in Sharm el-Sheikh, count on us to come up with another acronym. This time it's MARS, Methane Alert and Response System. And I think this has the future. I mean, if you see how quickly observation technologies are developing, and this is not just for methane, but I would think at some point we can all observe what emissions from which sources and what the composition of the gases are that are being emitted. This is going to be the future of how we observe and how we account and how we also make countries accountable for what they're doing. So this is one element in what I think will be a future development that will not just cover methane. So, and as you said, at COP27, we've also partnered with a number of major consumers and producers in a new effort on reducing methane emissions in the supply chain of oil, gas, and coal. We're also reviewing relevant waste, agriculture, and also industrial legislation to consider how to best capture methane. Our biggest challenge, as in this sector and in many other sectors, frankly, and in many countries, is in the agricultural sector. The reality is that livestock rearing accounts for about half of the EU's emissions of methane and for more than 6% of all EU greenhouse gas emissions. And in contrast to other pollutants, these emissions have been stable over the last 20 years. So we need to step up our action if we want to reach our 2030 air and climate objectives. And we are tackling it head on. The new Common Agriculture Policy coming into force next year has a budget of 387 billion euros, of which 40% is dedicated to climate action, with significant sums needed to go into, for example, improved livestock and manure management, a key sector when it comes to methane. In addition to the Fit for 55 package, the Commission also put forward a proposal for the Industrial Emissions Directive. In fact, this proposal captures only about 13% of the most polluting cattle farms, which are, however, responsible for a staggering 43% of methane emissions. So I want to be very clear about this. Our efforts to reduce methane emissions in agriculture are about the biggest polluters and not about small family farms, as sometimes it is portrayed. And you know this also from other sectors. The big polluters very often hide behind small farms or behind small companies or behind shops to try and let them do their bidding, but we shouldn't let them. And we should be very clear of who is responsible and who should take action. Mitigation of methane emissions can also be an additional and a new source of revenues for farmers. Our RePowerEU strategy foresees a 35 BCM contribution of biomethane by 2030. And I've seen earlier today, I see Flores here, also Shell announced that it would be doing more on biomethane. I really, really hope that is going to be successful. This energy crisis really pushes us into that direction, but we have to make sure it's the right biomethane and we don't create new problems elsewhere. So, yeah, let's work on this. So 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane by 2030. If waste from agriculture is properly used, we can be producing biomethane instead of producing methane emissions. And farmers can make money on waste. Just imagine, that logic. If you can turn it around, it's a problem, and then you turn it into an opportunity. I think, if waste is turned into cash, that is something that is a huge opportunity for the whole economy. Trash is cash, as I always say. In the climate crisis, delaying action will cause more damage and cost than acting on time. This is something I grapple with almost on a daily basis, that especially now in this crisis we're in, with the war, with the energy prices being so high and people struggling, saying, slow down, it's too much. But I continue to argue that slowing down means more costs, more difficulties. The longer you wait, the heavier the burden. The quicker you act, the lighter the burden, and the quicker the results will come in. And we don't want to delay action. We can't afford to delay action. And all economic actors have to contribute now. So you mentioned the co-legislators, the Council and Parliament. I count on both of them to maintain our climate ambition and to take swift steps to take forward both the Methane Regulation and the Industrial Emissions Directive with the right level of ambition. I would like to conclude with a few final words on the role of methane mitigation in RePowerEU. With Russian gas imports drastically reduced to 9%, down from 40%, we will be importing at least 100 BCM less of Russian gas in a scale of a year. Almost all of these 100 billion cubic meters stay in Russia because there is no alternative infrastructure to export all of this gas anywhere else. In the EU, most of this gap left by Russian gas will be replaced by demand reduction, because the cheapest gas today is the gas we don't use. 15% reduction in EU gas demand in the scale of a year means that over 50 billion cubic meters is simply not replaced by alternative sources of gas. In parallel, we are working hard to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy technologies and renewable hydrogen production, imports and infrastructure. So there is no new dash for gas. But the opposite is also not true. We simply cannot pull the plug on gas entirely from one day to the other. This is an illusion we need, especially in certain areas of our society. We need to convince people that you can't just pull the plug from one day to the other. Gas will remain a transitional fuel in many sectors and many regions, not just in Europe. So whatever is not covered by more efficiency, more renewables, and more hydrogen needs to be diversified. And also for this, the The methane regulation is an absolute must, so we can do so responsibly. The more biomethane we can produce ourselves, the less LNG we have to import from elsewhere. And I think this is a reasoning, if you think in terms of Europe's energy sovereignty, you have to think in terms of especially what we can do ourselves. That's reducing our consumption, that is speeding up the transition to renewable energy, and that is looking at, for instance, biomethane as something that can be literally homegrown, literally produced on the basis of our waste, literally produced on the basis of what we have here. And even if we do all of that, importing LNG will still be a necessity, importing pipeline natural gas will still be a necessity. I emphasize this because I don't want anybody to have any illusions of where we are. I was told many times at COP, Europe is killing the Green Deal, it's finished. Europe is digging up coal again, and I think I could prove convincingly that we stick to the Green Deal, that through the negotiations we've held with our co-legislators, we can even say that our goal of reducing at least with 55% our emissions by 2030, we can even go beyond that. And on the basis of what we've done so far, I can safely say that we will probably be at least 57% reduction. And who knows, if we continue to negotiate, we can do even better. So Europe is on track to do what we have promised. But we will have to do some things differently than we had announced previously. Because there is less gas, there will be more coal used in the short run, which means we have to do more on reducing our consumption, and we have to move quicker on the transition to renewables and also on the production of more biomethane. So I think this is the honest truth of where we are, what we need to do, and I think it would be very important if we share that information, if we discuss that information, if we listen to those who think we can do better. I'm more than open for that. But I believe this is the way forward for Europe, and you understand very well that for us, turning methane from a problem into an opportunity, turning methane from something that's choking us literally to something that would help us solve the problem in the energy sector is something we can do. The technology's there. All we need is political will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Indeed, at COP27, this was a message that we heard a lot from global partners around the world, that there is an impression that the EU is reining back climate ambition in light of the Ukraine war, and certainly quick action on the methane regulation would be one way to prove that narrative wrong. So let's talk more about what's next. We're going to have a lightning round of presentations now, and you're finally going to hear from Tomasz and James, who've been sitting here patiently on the stage. But before I introduce them, we're going to have a video message. I mentioned at the beginning that we are getting some movement in the European Parliament on this file, so we're going to hear a little bit about what's going on over there in that institution from Martin Hodzik, who's a member of the European Parliament from Slovakia, who sits in the Renew Europe group of liberals. Martin has recorded a video message for us where he's going to tell us about the current status of EU regulations on methane and the next steps in the negotiations for this proposal. So let's cue up that video now.
Dear participants, we have collectively committed to reduce the global methane emissions at least by 30% in 2030. And now we take the first steps to materialize our promises. It's only regrettable that the European Parliament that I represent wasted several months discussing the competencies between its committees. I will not pretend that we are now moving fast in the Parliament towards a trilogue mandate, as the political discussion on the main topics is ahead of us, and at this point we have meetings planned throughout the January, which realistically speaking means that we'll adopt our position in February at best. Nevertheless, I hope that being urged not only by the climate crisis but also by the energy crisis, we'll push all political groups to accelerate our talks and most importantly to agree on an ambitious position. Despite the different starting positions that we have, we cannot afford to lose more time, as it is almost a year since the Commission has published its proposal. We cannot let tens of billions of cubic meters of methane be wasted by flaring and venting into the atmosphere, while people are freezing, while households cannot afford to pay the bills, and while we all have simple, relatively cheap, or even profitable tools to slow down climate change simply by restricting venting and monitoring and repairing the energy assets. I would like to thank Mr. Timmermans for being very firm on this during the COP27, because he said it's very rightly, it's like madness. Flaring gas as well, it's crazy. The EU should not protect backsliders, but trigger change inside and outside of the EU. The methane regulation is an environmental, social and economic opportunity that we have to seize. Which brings me to my priorities that I'm defending in the negotiations. We have to clarify the language. Leak is a leak and vent is a vent. We have to make sure all leaks are detected and repaired, and that routine venting is minimized to situations that forces operators to vent, such as for safety reasons. Also, we have to make sure that the best and most sensitive technology is being used for detection, and we are ready for the future developments. Otherwise, we undermine the technological development in the EU and punish all forward-looking companies that we have in Europe and that knock on our door daily. I believe that we have to in some way include imports in the framework. Otherwise, we will omit the majority of our emissions in the energy sector. There are already studies that analyze the possibility to act on this line within the international trade rules. We need a sound international monitoring system and transparency with regard to emissions, and to streamline access to environmental justice worldwide by leading by example. I will stop here, not to cut from the time for other speakers and discussions, and I really apologize for not being able to be with you today, but I hope and wish you a fruitful discussion.
So there we have it. There's an outline of what's going on in terms of regulation right now, and then what the next steps might be in the European Parliament. Let's next hear a kind of scientific overview of where we are right now. I'd like to introduce Thomas Rockman, who's a professor at Utrecht University, who will be telling us about the impact of methane emissions from the oil and gas sector from a scientific viewpoint. Thomas?
Yes, thanks a lot. And indeed, I'm going to present a little bit the facts or some figures to the sentences that you have seen before. So I've prepared some slides here. And I want to convince you that methane really plays an important role in reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. I want to focus on a couple of points. First, I will recapture why methane matters for the Paris Agreement. I will try to convince you that it's necessary to have robust measurement-based estimates of methane emissions to implement mitigation technologies at the speed and the scale that they need to be done. Then I will inform you about the quantification infrastructure or capacity that we have been building up in Europe over the past years in the scientific world. And I will end with some examples where we have applied these techniques to quantify emissions throughout Europe. So let's start with the first one. Oops, I don't manage to change the slide now. Yeah, there we go. What you see here on the left-hand side is the global warming that we have realized since pre-industrial times. It's 1.1 degrees overall on the global scale in the decade 2010 to 2019. And on the right-hand side, you see the contributions from the long-lived greenhouse gases to this warming. And I focused only on the long-lived greenhouse gases. You see now the figure behind the statement that methane is responsible for roughly 45% or so of the global warming. But even if, as a scientist, if I take the worst estimate, the lower envelope of this arrow bar there, it's at least 25% of the global warming at the moment is caused by methane increase in the atmosphere. What is methane doing now? It is increasing, and you have also heard that. This is the methane curve, global average methane in the last more than 30 years since we have done measurements in the atmosphere. And what you see is there was actually a period where we thought maybe methane is not increasing fast anymore. That may have been related actually to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's one of the theories. But in the last years, it has really increased tremendously. And as you have heard, the last year that on record now is the fastest methane increase that we have ever observed in the atmosphere. And of course, this is worrying because it's also really a limitation of reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's shown in the next slide here. You see on the right, well, you see the total anthropogenic emissions in million tons of methane per year in 2020 and the projections for 2030. And you see that if you go on like planned or business as usual, the emissions will not decrease, but they will increase. On the other hand, the plans or the trajectories for reaching the 1.5 degree warming limit, they actually propose that emissions need to be cut. All trajectories that are in agreement with this 1.5 degree warming goal, they require a reduction of methane of 40 to 45%. And this is, well, the numbers on which the global methane pledge is also built on. So that's an important fraction of emissions that need to be reduced here. Another interesting point is also a positive note that if we actually manage to do that, it would, and it was also mentioned before, it would reduce the warming in 2050 by about 1/4 degree. So this is a substantial reduction in warming that we, well, may save our, that we can save on our trajectory to reach the Paris Agreement. Well, is this feasible? It was also already mentioned. The global methane assessment has split the saved emissions into the different sectors that were mentioned: agriculture, waste, and fossil fuels. And you see here the fossil fuel actually has a big contribution. These are basically useless emissions. No one had any benefit by leakages from fossil fuel emissions, so they should really be tackled. And that's why I'm going to talk mostly about fossil fuel emissions. Now I want to turn to the point that we need measurement-based estimates to realize the emission reductions. And I start with an example from the United States, where you see in the dark blue bar the methane intensity. That means the emitted methane per produced methane across the US. And the Environmental Protection Agency now estimates that 1.3% of all the methane that is produced gets into the atmosphere, so leaks out in one or the other way. If my American colleagues now do campaigns and they try to measure in different production regions, they usually find that these emissions are a factor 2, sometimes a factor 3 higher. So the emissions that we have on paper, they don't really, they don't mirror what we see in the atmosphere, where you cannot really hide molecules anymore. There's also, again, a good point in this figure. The green bar here is what the leading industry partners put as target. They say we can actually manage 0.2%. And this is a good news. If we actually manage that throughout the sector, we are there. We can reduce the emissions by the 75% or 80% that were mentioned. So it's even recognized by the industry that this is feasible. So that was from the US. Yes, let's go to Europe. And I want to pick one example on a study that we have been doing in Romania. When you go to the European Emission Inventory Report, and I read this when we were studying Romania, that is now the citation, the decrease relative to 1990s, that was still based on the Paris Agreement, of course, the Paris Agreement. The decrease relative to 1990 was mainly caused by some minor changes, but also a decrease in production and the change of methodology in Romania. And that is interesting, of course. All the country emissions are listed there, and you pick up the emissions and you make a table of that. You see the following picture here. So in 1990, the left bar here, you see the total emissions. These are the two colors together, and the dark blue emissions are the reported emissions from Romania. You see that more than half, even 2/3 of the emissions that were reported came from one country only in the EU. And when you look at 2017, you see that the emissions have been reduced tremendously, but Romania is really a much smaller share now. So Romanian emissions have actually, the reported emissions have been reduced by 95%. How can that be? Well, it is actually stated also in the report. If you look at the figure, these are the country emissions by year. The x-axis is the time scale, and you see the hashed or the crossed area. This is the country Romania. Well, what happens there? Interesting, right? From one year to the other, emissions dropped by maybe a factor of 10. How can that be? Well, it's also stated there. The emission factor for Romania was changed from the one from developing countries to developed countries in 2000. And of course, this is all according to regulations, and it's also nice and it's also transparent, but this is now part of the numbers that we are using in the EU to report our emissions and also report our pathways towards reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I'm not going to say which one of these now is right, but I'm going to say none of these factors was actually based on measurements in Romania. So we can actually not know which emission factor is correct, and that's why we actually went there, and I will show you some results in a couple of minutes. First of all, I will tell you about a project. It was the Marie Sklodowska-Curie initial training network, where we put together 9 academic institutions in Europe and 16 non-academic partners, often from industry. And we made use of the really exciting new development 10 years ago, that new instruments became available that can quantify methane emissions within a second and to a super high precision, 1 parts per billion. And this is comparable to the increase in precision that you see now in the satellite sector. So a decade ago, we had that for the in situ sector. What can you do then? You can put these instruments on vehicles, on drones and aircraft, and you can go around and you will see in real life, you will see these methane emissions. And that really changed the field tremendously. So we were doing a lot of training of students. We had conferences, of course, but we also went to the field and we did measurements, and we applied these new techniques to many emission points in the project that is called MIMO squared, Methane Goes Mobile, Measurements and Modeling. That's what we did in this project. And to end, I will show you 3 examples of the application of these mobile methods. The first one is from Poland. The Upper Siberian coal basin is the biggest, well, includes the biggest single emission points in Europe. You can even see this now, these days, also from the satellite, the ventilation shafts from the coal mines. So we went there and we teamed up with a project that was very early in our project. We teamed up with the DLR from Germany that had an aircraft there, and we had vehicles. And you see now these yellow lines, these are flight tracks, which are actually encountering the Siberian coal mining basin, and the other colored green and blue and red lines, these are vehicle tracks that we carried out on the ground. And then we put all this data together and we produce these curtains that you see on the bottom left, and where the red colors means we have high emissions. And this is actually a cross-section along a downwind flight leg that goes now to the ground to several stages across the atmosphere. And from these measurements, we estimated the emissions for the total Upper Silesian coal basin. And the good thing in this case was our estimates from atmospheric measurements, they really agree with the reported numbers. And this is also nice, that sometimes the reported numbers agree with what we find in the atmosphere. I will go to the second example now, which are the upstream emissions in the southern Romanian oil and gas production region. We went with a large team of scientists from more than 10 institutions with many vehicles and drones and aircraft and made measurements. We went to more than 1,000 individual oil wells to visit them. We quantified more than 300 of them, really with a high precision quantification. We also made aircraft measurements. You see that on the figure on the top right, where you see individual production locations which were provided by the operator. And then the circle around that is methane, and in the corner you see the plume of this cluster of production regions that is emitted and that's picked up by the aircraft measurements. And from these measurements we calculate emission rates again. We also went with an industrial partner with an optical gas imaging camera, and they made these images that you probably have seen from James and others. The image will turn to the infrared in a second, and then you will see that on the right-hand side, close to where you see also this pressure dial, there is simply an open end where gas is simply vented to the atmosphere. Yeah, it is coming out now. You see the black plume. This is methane absorbing in the infrared and simply going out to the atmosphere without any prevention. And it's not the only example that we found like that in Romania. We also found, and that is the last figure here on the bottom right, that the emissions, they have a skewed distribution, as we call it. That means that there are a few sites which have disproportionately high emissions. And you see here now that the lowest, or the only 10% of the sites here on the x-axis, they are responsible for 50 or 60% of the total emissions. So if we can find these sites and fix the emissions, we have already reduced them by a factor of 2. The final example I want to give is about something that we can do really in our own environment. These are city emissions. We had these new analyzers, we deployed them on cars in many different cities. And the example that I show here is now from my home city, Utrecht. This is a movie where you see that we really go through the cities on a street level, and each of these peaks is a methane emission. And it can be a leak. It can also be an emission from the wastewater system, for example. And we are trying also to use other tracers to decide what is now a gas leak, what comes from the wastewater system, what is a combustion source. And you see here that we can cover entire cities, medium-sized cities, in 2 weeks or so, and really make a very nice 3D picture of these emission rates. And that also means then provide information to the DSOs to go and fix these leaks. We find generally tens or hundreds of gas leaks in each city. We surveyed more than 10 cities in the EU, and each city has a certain fingerprint of emissions. So some of them have more gas leaks, other of them have more biogenic emissions. And we have demonstrated now with these measurements, if you do them regularly, if you go more often than the gas utilities actually do, you will find the leaks and you can reduce them, and you can again reduce emissions quickly. And my last picture here on the bottom right shows the largest leak that we have found so far. It was in the Amsterdam Harbor region. And that is also related to the point that this is profitable, because we found 2 leaks there, really big ones. And if you calculate the climate impact of only 2 gas leaks, it's the climate impact of 4,000 cars, if you calculate it over a year, these emissions. And it has a consumer value of 150,000 euros. And that was not even with the really current gas prices, but it was already with the Ukraine war gas prices calculated. So that means by only finding these 2 leaks, I think we could employ a person to do these measurements for a year in many other cities and many other environments. So to conclude, I hope I've shown you that methane does matter, that we have the instruments, that we have the methods to detect the emissions, and that it's also important to do these measurements to base the methane emissions actually on quantitative measurements that we get with these new analyzers. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Thomas. Some really interesting data there, and I think it's excellent context for our discussion. And indeed, we'll be talking more about the particularities of the Romanian situation in our first panel when we're hearing from Mihai. Next, I'd like to introduce James Torito, who is the Methane Pollution Prevention Campaign Manager at the Clean Air Task Force. James will be giving us a presentation on the documentation of methane emissions as part of the Cut Methane EU campaign.
Thank you. And thank you, Thomas, for an excellent presentation. I mean, what Thomas has done is really laid a foundation of what the scientific research is around methane in the EU, and looking at the empirical science behind where emissions are occurring. What I want to show is what our campaign's been doing over the last 2 years since we launched it in 2020, looking at where major sources of methane emissions are occurring across the oil and gas sector. So yeah, we've been documenting methane emissions across across the EU using one of these optical gas imaging infrared cameras that Thomas has talked about in his presentation. These are very simple tools and instruments that are calibrated to look at methane emissions on the infrared spectrum and can easily be used and deployed. They're fairly inexpensive when you talk about 150,000 euros a month or a year from 1-2 emission sources. When you start to add that up, the return on investment with these cameras, training staff and getting them into the field and deploying them on a frequent basis just quickly gets a high return on investment. So we've been using these cameras across Europe, and over the last 2 years we visited 14 different countries in Europe, surveying more than 300 oil and gas sites across these different countries, and looking and finding approximately 500 individual sources of emissions. These are sources of emissions that could include all sorts of instruments across the oil and gas supply chain at all sorts of facilities. Oil wells, I'll get into the facilities a little bit more, but wells, everything from upstream production to downstream and distribution with a little bit less less work than Thomas's team has put into it. But the thing about where these leaks and emission sources are taking place is that just looking at a model of what Europe's oil and gas supply chain looks like. You go from some limited onshore production, a lot of imports through LNG facilities as well as import pipelines, and then you have kind of distribution grid across the entire continent, including a lot of gathering boosting stations, processing plants, transmission compressor stations, underground storage facilities. So there's a lot of different facilities across Europe where you're going to have gas emissions. And then you have the distribution grids, which Thomas thoroughly looked at across the city study. We've primarily focused on these particular areas in the upstream and transmission sector because with the instruments that we've been using and using optical gas imaging, these are most ripe for detecting emissions in those areas. When you're looking at downstream distribution, some of the other equipment that the science folks have been using is more relevant in those areas. But the optical gas imaging camera is one of many tools also. Especially when you're thinking about looking at large-scale emission sources, there aren't these super emitters that we're seeing. We'll get into this in the second panel with Christian and the Kairos team. The work that they've been doing, you don't see a lot of the super emitter sources in Europe. So a lot of the prevention of emissions are going to happen at the ground level using the types of equipment that we've been using. The optical gas imaging as well as the other equipment that Thomas's team been using in these mobile measurement units. And so that's where you're looking at the kind of production, processing, transmission, and distribution systems. So, running through some of the different types of sources that we see and how easy these are to fix. Thomas has shown a fair number of these videos as well of oil wells. I think the point is that this isn't just happening in Romania. Romania is certainly a major problem for the EU when it's thinking about its methane emissions, but it's happening across Europe. And we're looking at oil and gas sites. We're looking at underground gas pipelines where emissions have been detected, where we've detected them. Also, storage tanks, whether it's continuous venting emissions or intermittent venting that's being allowed with flashing of methane to reduce pressure. And then there's often component failures that occur at sites. I mean, these are the kind of things that you see when you go out into the field and you sort of spend some time surveying these facilities. You quickly can see a lot of different sources of emissions. And these are the types of things that, through process planning, through leak detection and repair programs, you can quickly find, mitigate, emit. For venting sites like this, it takes a little more planning in terms of what you'll actually do with the emissions or the methane instead of venting into the atmosphere, but rerouting it into the gas system. But what I think the point of this is that methane is happening. Getting ahead of myself. I'm trying to go back. Methane emissions are happening everywhere across Europe. It's for a while there hasn't. There's kind of talk that Europe wasn't as bad as elsewhere, which is certainly true. The amount of production of oil and gas in Europe is fairly low. We've discussed that, in the upstream sectors where, a lot of Europe's methane emissions are occurring. So these figures have been mentioned a little bit, but I want to dive into this some more. Europe's methane footprint, EU's methane footprint goes well beyond its borders. But it is the largest importer of oil and gas, and it has the largest methane footprint of any importer country from the upstream emissions. So there's over 10 million tons of methane being emitted from suppliers to the EU. And now this figure is from the IEA. It's about 2 years old. Obviously, this includes a lot of gas coming from Russia, but the figure is not going to change significantly when you think about changes in new suppliers. You know, a lot of the new suppliers that Europe is striking deals with are not signatories of the Global Methane Pledge. They're not signatories of a lot of other methane initiatives that that have taken place around the world. And so, you know, thinking about an import standard in some of these countries is going to be incredibly important too. I think, you know, the point of showing a lot of these videos too, and kind of talking through my slides and what we've seen, is that a lot of this work is very simple and very easy. You know, I've been out with a lot of engineers from companies walking through their sites who haven't been out with a camera before, and you know, I walk around with them, show them what's happening on their site because they haven't actually ever taken a look, in some cases, at their facilities, and then they quickly can spot what's the problem and fix it. And in many cases, it can be fixed within a few days, and it's sometimes it's as simple as that. And so that's why, you know, leak detection and repair is one key part of the methane regulation that needs to be in place. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be regular, and companies need to just get out into the field. I think, you know, one of the things that we've realized is that, you know, across EU, there's certainly good companies that are doing well and performing well. There are countries where, you know, countries are performing well in terms of emissions intensities. But, you know, it's not all the same. It's very different across different countries. And so that's what is so critical about this regulation. So making sure that everyone's on the same page. And I want to finish with something that we've recently done, which is a public opinion poll. So it's showing, you know, looking at, you know, people's interests in methane emissions regulations. And so we did a survey earlier this summer in Germany, Poland, Italy, and France, looking at people's interest in reducing methane. So it's clear that there's overwhelming interest in strong regulation of methane, with 90% of people in support of these regulations. And we even found very, very high results when people were responding to whether or not there would be increases on gas prices, which is certainly not something that's necessarily going to be the case when you're saving a lot of money from the programs that are being implemented. But we want to test different attitudes, and so we still have very, very strong high attitudes towards methane regulations. So there's a lot of support in the countries that we surveyed. And so with that, I will end there, and then we can move on to the next one.
Great. Thanks very much, James. So we're now going to move on to the first panel, where we'll be really diving into how to best cut domestic methane emissions. But before we do that, we have a short video to show you, which is going to show exactly how methane emissions can be cut. So let's cue up that video now.
Did you know that the fastest way to slow global warming is to reduce emissions from the gas methane? Methane is an invisible, odorless greenhouse gas, but it's powerful. And according to the IPCC, it's responsible for about 0.5 degrees of the global warming we've experienced to date. Methane traps 84 times more heat than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years that it's released into the air, and the amount of it in our atmosphere has been surging for the last 15 years. The faster the planet's temperatures rise, the more likely and the sooner we will see irreversible damage to our environment. So where does all this methane come from? 60% of the methane in our atmosphere comes from human activity, and the rest comes from natural sources like wetlands and permafrost melting. Methane from natural sources will keep rising while the planet heats up. But methane from human sources is preventable with the right public policies in place. Most methane pollution caused by human activity comes from fossil fuels, agriculture, and waste. 35% of methane comes from oil, gas, and coal. 32% of methane comes from animals raised for meat and dairy. 19% comes from waste, such as landfills and sewage. Another 8% comes from rice cultivation, and the rest comes from biomass burning, biogas production, and industry. A growing number of global leaders agree that cutting methane pollution is the fastest way to slow global warming. Fortunately, we have low-cost solutions to reduce methane emissions quickly in the next decade. More than 115 countries have signed on to the Global Methane Pledge, which aims to reduce global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And scientists say we can go even further to prevent a staggering 0.3 degrees of warming by 2040. The number might sound small, but the impact could be huge by preventing water shortages for millions, loss of food crops, increase in droughts, and much more. We cannot keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius without deep cuts to both methane and CO2. It is critical that policymakers around the world move quickly and aggressively to cut methane emissions now. Without immediate action, we won't meet the climate goals to reduce this powerful greenhouse gas and slow the rate of warming on our planet.
Okay, so welcome back. So we're now going to dive into the first panel where we'll be talking about how to best cut domestic methane emissions from fossil fuels in Europe. And I'm joined here on stage by Alessia Virone, EU Affairs Director at the Clean Air Task Force, and by Mihai Stoica, Executive Director at the Romanian NGO 2 Celsius. And we are joined by video, remotely by Tomasz de Oliveira Brederiol from the International Energy Agency, the independent intergovernmental organization based in Paris. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. Alessia, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about what's going on right now with current EU regulations on methane.
Well, the regulation has been published now for almost a year, and we can see that both the Council and the Parliament have made a lot of progress towards reaching their own position on this regulation. Of course, the Council started earlier, so they're a bit closer to reach their general position. And when we look at the Commission proposal, we can see that there were already a lot of very positive elements in it. So you had the MRV progressively going more granular. You had frequent LDAR, with frequency part being really important in that sentence. And you had a general ban of routine venting and flaring with a list of exceptions. And so all these are very positive approach. But what we needed to see is that the co-legislator needed to fix some of the technical issue and to increase the ambition. So on the technical issue, methane regulation is going to be a very technical regulation, and we need to have the technicality right, because any kind of gaps or unclarity could hamper the ability of the regulation to cut methane emission. And we've seen that both the Council and the Parliament have dedicated a lot of attention to address this technical issue. For example, related to sampling representativeness for MRV, related to the technology that can be used for LDAR, related to venting by design equipment. We've seen that, for example, in the Council, each version has been more and more accurate on how to address this issue. And in the Parliament, we've seen a lot of MEP tabling amendments to address these technical parts. So that's on the technical side that needed to be addressed by the co-legislator. But there is also an ambition part that needed to be addressed. So as it was mentioned before, the EU has been taking the lead internationally to push for cutting methane emission all around the world. And so we do want to have the more ambitious regulation in the world that other countries can use as an example when they're developing their own. And for that, we need to be a bit more ambitious than what we have been now. So for example, on LDAR, we need to move from quarterly LDAR to monthly one. With quarterly LDAR, you can cut 80% of the emission due to leak. With monthly, you can cut 90%. And what we've seen in both the Council and the Parliament is that there has been a lot of effort to, on the contrary, weaken this kind of frequency instead of increasing their ambition. So that is a bit concerning. Now we're getting closer of both the Council, getting the general approach, hopefully very soon. The Parliament is also hoping to vote the reports just after Christmas. So we're getting closer to there, and we really hope to see them address not only the technical side, but also address the level of ambitions that this regulation should have.
So that's what's happening at EU level. Let's hear about what's happening at international level from Tomasz. Tomasz, what is happening with methane internationally?
Hello, can you hear me well, just to double check?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, great. So what we we have been seeing internationally is really methane abatement going from moment to momentum. I mean, until 2020, there were very few countries that were taking action to reduce methane emissions, especially in the fossil fuel sector. Now, since COP last year, we saw the launch of the Global Methane Pledge. We saw 100 countries signing up to it. And now at COP27, we had 150 countries that have signed on to the pledge. And these countries now cover the vast majority of oil and gas production. For coal supply, that is still not the case. I mean, there's a very important supplier and market for coal, which is China. China is engaged in methane abatement. They recognize the importance of it. They are looking to reduce methane emissions in their fossil fuel sector, but they haven't signed on to the Global Methane Pledge yet. And it's not only about signing on to the pledge. Many people here are aware that the pledge is on a global level. It doesn't put on a target for specific countries. But now the pledge has very clear pathways. There's a pathway for energy, one for food and agriculture, and another one for waste. And all of these have funding streams to support methane abatement and strategies to bridge existing gaps for further action. And I'd like to just spend a few moments on the energy pathway. The energy pathway sets out to capture the maximum potential of cost-effective methane mitigation in the oil and gas sector. So right now, at the current gas prices, as we have heard from Jonathan Banks and from the Vice President Frans Timmermans, gas prices are really high, so almost all of the technically abatable methane emissions are cost-effective. And also, by signing onto the energy pathway, countries are pledging to eliminate routine flaring as soon as possible and no later than 2030. So we're gaining traction. We've heard also about the joint declaration from energy importers and exporters on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. The US, the EU, Japan, Canada, Norway, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, so many of the key markets there have committed to working towards creation of an international market for fossil energy that minimizes flaring, methane, and CO2 emissions across the value chain to the fullest extent practicable. So it's also a major step. We've also heard about the launch of MARS, the Methane Alert and Response System. This will be a system coordinated by the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which will facilitate the detection of major leaks and help regulators and the industry to address those leaks as quickly as possible. And we are not only seeing action at the international level, we are also seeing a lot of regulation and policy efforts on national level. This month, Nigeria became the first African country to regulate methane emissions from its oil and gas sector, and the regulations are quite comprehensive. It's always possible to go further, but as a first step, it's a very important one. Earlier this year, Colombia became the first South American country to regulate methane emissions from its oil and gas sector, also a very important step. As we heard, Canada is currently working to strengthen its regulatory framework to achieve a reduction of at least 75% of methane emissions in its oil and gas sector by 2030 relative to 2012 levels. So that's a lot of ambition that has been followed through by action and by regulatory proposals. And I could go on and on here, talk about how Pemex is being supported by US EPA, how Malaysia's national oil and gas company and regulator Petronas has announced a target, how Egypt is pledging to complete an oil and gas methane roadmap. But I mean, this is just a few examples to show that we are gaining momentum. There's still a lot to go. I mean, as we've seen, methane emissions are not going down, but hopefully this action will lead to reductions in the near future.
Thanks, Tomasz. That's a good overview, and you can really see there's a lot of moving parts there. This is kind of like a giant global puzzle where all these different policies are going to have to fit together. Mihai, let's turn to you next. So we heard from Tomasz just a moment ago how Romania has a special place in terms of methane emissions. In Europe, we know that a significant chunk of EU oil and gas methane emissions occur in Romania. What's going on there right now in terms of methane emissions, and why is it that Romania has such a prominent place in methane?
I think it has it's the fourth place in methane emission from oil and gas in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, right now. So you have to understand that Romania has the entire supply chain of oil and gas production. So it has a history of 120 years of production. But just to understand the level of the infrastructure right now is oil and gas wells and the infrastructure around them, so in the upstream sector, have been operational for around between 30 and 60 years. In the storage, so midstream sectors, we have storage that has been installed in the 1950s, mid-1950s, and with minimal interventions in that sector for the past 30 years. So you can see it's a very large infrastructure, but at the same time it's a very poorly maintained infrastructure. So yeah, as Thomas was saying earlier, methane emissions from the oil and gas sector have decreased significantly. They have almost halved since 2003. But this doesn't say much because at the same time there's no measurements that are happening in Romania. So these are estimations. Romania is reporting methane emissions in its national inventory to the UNFCCC by Tier 1. Tier 1, which means that it's general estimations, worldwide, no site level or facility level measurements. I mean, the companies, there are two companies in Romania that produce most of the oil and gas, and that's Petrom and Romgaz. They cover about 90% of production. And these companies have taken very, very few steps towards abatement of methane emissions. And that's, I think, very important. At the same time, at the level of in terms of governance, Romania is really not doing anything. So, very shortly on that, it's not part of any of the international mechanisms. The Romanian oil and gas companies are not part of OGMP 2.0. We've talked about it earlier, and so it's not part of the knowledge sharing that's happening at international level, although it has this big leaky infrastructure. And hopefully with the Romeo study that Thomas presented earlier and its outcomes, we're going to see a lot more that Romania can do in terms of reducing its upstream and midstream emissions, because the initial findings is basically like oil wells, gas wells, compressor stations, the leaks and storage tanks. The leaks that are happening from this infrastructure can be easily covered with LDAR, and I think Thomas can say a little bit more about that. The IEA basically estimates that 70% of Romania's oil and gas emissions can be reduced with no net cost. So, well, actually, only 43% can be reduced with no net cost, but 70% can be reduced with very low costs.
So, Alessia, I want to go back to the EU proposal, because we're hearing that this can be done with no net cost, that this is a no-brainer in terms of saving companies money and saving the climate. And yet, this proposal came out a full year ago, and we haven't seen fast action on it. Why do you think this file has seemed to stall in the EU legislatures? And have you seen any impetus when RePowerEU came out? So this is the Commission's proposal to respond to the energy crisis from the Ukraine war by phasing out Russian fossil fuels. Did RePowerEU give any oomph, any additional speed to this proposal working its way through the legislatures?
So first of all, the reason why it was stalled at first was because in the Parliament you had a bit of a conflict of competency between two different committees. This legislation is very clearly on the energy sector, but at the same time it has an environmental goal. And so the Parliament was a bit delayed to decide which committee would have the lead. They decided to go for a co-lead in the end. In the Council, obviously, the work was also delayed by the crisis. I mean, last year when we started the work, we were fighting one crisis, the climate one, and then suddenly you had to fight two crises at once, both the climate one and the energy security one. And of course, that took a lot of time from the people working on the energy legislation in Brussels, both in the Council and in the Parliament, to start focusing on all the emergency measures that we were developing. To be honest, I think we prefer all to have the people take their time to get the legislation right instead of getting the legislation fast. And contrary to a lot of legislation like the ETS or the red one that I also discussed, this one is a new one. So policymakers also need to have the time to build the expertise to understand all the different aspects of the legislation so that they can come up with the measures that are needed. Now, when we look at RePowerEU, there is a clear connection between our energy crisis and the methane one. As it was mentioned before, today, with the leaks and with all the venting and flaring that we're doing, we're kind of wasting a lot of gas that we would really need to use. So there is a connection between making sure that all the gas in the pipeline actually make it to the consumer and trying to address our energy security issue at the moment. And so we definitely hope to see more of a connection there, but we already saw some kind of connection in the RePowerEU communication strategy, and a lot of methane consideration being integrated in our discussion with new import partner for energy. However, it's a bit difficult to say that it has really helped the methane legislation, since I think this last month, a lot of the energy discussion has been overshadowed by the crisis we're facing now in Europe.
Yeah, indeed, that's certainly been sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room, not to mix metaphors. But we know that the EU has this proposal on the table, and countries around the world are looking at it. But Tomasz, in terms of how this fits into the global picture, so we just had COP27 conclude over in Egypt, and we heard a little bit in the speeches a little while ago about the movements from COP26 to COP27. I think really most of the movement we saw at COP26 in Glasgow, but there was a little bit at COP27, and I think we heard that 95% of the NDCs now include action on methane emissions. From your vantage point, what concretely came out of COP27 in terms of methane emissions, and would you characterize it as a success in terms of methane?
I would say that we are moving in the right direction. So one of the key things about the Global Methane Pledge are the methane action plans. So once we have countries setting up action plans and defining how they will reduce emissions, then we can go into the action plans and see what they are actually doing or not. And they will be accountable for the pledge that they have taken. So I think we saw progress because we saw many countries delivering methane action plans, and I'm hopeful that by next COP we will have all countries that signed on to the pledge having an action plan and hopefully already delivering on some of it. I would also say that there was a major development in between the two COPs, which was the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. I think, the United States is one of the largest oil and gas methane emissions in the world, and this act brought into place, or will put into place, a price on methane emissions. This is not something that we see in the proposed EU regulations for methane emissions, but it's quite a significant price, and it's a price that could potentially really change the market. And it is proposed that it will be accompanied by a robust measurement system. So hopefully that development will make a big difference for the situation in the US, which now with all of the changes in imports, gas imports to the EU, would have a greater role in terms of the imported emissions footprint of the EU.
To this issue of a price on methane, we actually have a question related to that from the audience. I'll go to that in just a second. But first, Mihai, I wanted to ask you about your expectations for the EU approach, coming from the Romanian perspective, but also looking at how it's going to affect the EU policy in this area as a whole. What are you expecting from the EU approach? What are you hoping for from the EU approach?
Well, I think we haven't done anything to tackle imports, and I think this is the largest problem that we have at the moment. I mean, even coming from a country like Romania with the entire supply chain of oil and gas, the level of imports that we're seeing does in Europe in general does outweigh what we produce. So the expectation would be that we would find a way to sort of either tax the incoming oil and gas to Europe, or find a way for buyers of oil and gas in Europe to know at least what they're buying, to have it sort of, let's say, that we know basically if anything's being done at international level. And I have this story about Gazprom, for example, which has reported on the basis of OGMP that its fugitive emissions are at the lowest level in the world. And if we cannot verify that, so that if there's no verification on companies at all at international level, in Romania we have the same example. It's like it's very much reliant on self-reporting, and if there's no third-party verification of those figures, then again we will have a very big problem in looking and choosing the right imports that come into Europe that are tackling fugitive emissions.
Well, let me take a question from the audience. Again, if you're here in the room, you can ask your question by scanning the QR code, typing them into Slido. I'll get them up here on the tablet. First question is from Lennart Paetz. Leslie, I'll put this to you first. So are there considerations to introduce a CBAM-like mechanism to reduce imported methane emissions, like we were just talking about? CBAM is what we're not supposed to call a carbon border tax, but it is the amount that imports would be charged to make up for if they don't face as stringent climate legislation in the country that they're coming from. Has this been discussed at all for methane?
Not really. At the moment, we're really looking at how we can cut methane emission by putting measure and requirements. The CBAM hasn't been adopted yet, so it's a bit difficult to see already how you can implement it on another kind of gas. At the same time, if we do have a CBAM for methane, we already can see that some of the countries could be good partners in developing it. Like as was mentioned, now that the US has a price on methane, it would also make it easier to discuss it internationally. But the price, like either with a CBAM or like with a tax, does need to work with requirements on how to do ELDR. And that's what we see in other parts of the world too. Even in the US, sure, they have a methane tax, but they also have to develop requirements on how to do MLV and how to do ELDR. You cannot just have one without the other. On the CBAM part, I would say it's definitely an option that deserves some attention in the future, but we will need to keep it very separated between methane and CO2 because it's very difficult to have the two of them together given the fact that they have very different global warming potential. But that's definitely an option that could be explored in the future.
Yeah, you mentioned the price. So Tomas, I want to come back to you on this issue because of course with CBAM, one of the issues has been that the EU has a price on carbon, the US does not. That's going to make CBAM a little difficult when you're looking at whether it would apply to the US. And for methane, we seem to have the opposite situation. That's the US will have a price on methane and the EU will not. So how is price going to factor in there? And do you think there would be any possibility for something like an import tax for methane?
There's certainly some space in that area, but I think, yeah, we first really need to start measuring better emissions. It will be very hard to enforce any kind of tax on imports if we don't have a good idea of what are the level of emissions in different countries. Right now, satellites do provide us some information, and hopefully next year with the launch of MethaneSat, we are going to be seeing really a step change in how satellites work because it's really targeted on oil and gas methane emissions. But still, I mean, we won't be able to see in very cloudy regions, in very snowy regions. So we can't rely only on satellites to deliver the information of how much methane is leaking from oil and gas operations in different regions. So I think the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0 framework is a good framework for, getting to a point where we will have a better certainty of what are methane emissions in different parts of the world and different companies, and that hopefully, perhaps one day could be used for these kinds of measures. That said, in the meantime, I think there's a lot to be done with trade partners. Right now, we released some analysis in this year's World Energy Outlook. The EU could get almost as much gas as it was importing from Nord Stream 2 from its trade partners if they were to really deploy all the abatement technologies to reduce flaring and methane emissions in their national oil and gas industries. So these are companies, these are countries like Algeria, like Egypt, also like the US, which currently have a lot of methane emissions, and perhaps if we engage in the right conversation in the right way, and especially for developing economies, provide institutional and technical support, they would be able to deliver these gas volumes to the EU and improve energy security, often through trade routes that are already existent. So, for example, Algeria has already a pipeline with spare capacity to the EU, which could, if there was further action on methane there, deliver volumes to the European Union.
Mihai, I'm going to put this next question from the audience to you. It's from Leonard. Seeing the possible profitability of preventing venting, that was a tongue twister, why do suppliers seemingly not care about it? It looks like relatively low-hanging fruit. So this would be an obvious question anyone looking at this would say. If this is as obvious and low cost as we're saying, why aren't they doing it?
Well, I can talk for Romania, which is, and for its for the companies that are operating in Romania, they have very little incentive, for example, to invest in assets that are going to be closing down in the next few years. So, for example, Petrom, the main company in Romania, has a program where it will close down its oil and gas wells, half of its oil and gas wells, by 2024. So there's very low incentive for the company to invest in, I don't know, LDAR program or monitoring program to address those leaks. And again, with those wells, a part of the adjacent infrastructure will also be divested from. So this is, I think this is also very important. What is also very important is the incentives that are provided at national level in terms of, for example, if there's a windfall tax on energy producers right now, including oil and gas, but it does not, that windfall tax does not include sort of, like a tax reduction for investments that have been made in upgrading the infrastructure. So I think this is also, and since we're talking about incentives, they sort of need to be there for oil and gas companies to be able to make the investments, and even for recouping the methane that they can use. Right now, for example, again, Petrom has a program where it recovers some of its methane emissions from some of its facilities, and has invested in small power plants that can power their wells. So, I think also if they were part of these larger international mechanisms, these oil companies would also have more know-how and would go for these low-hanging fruits.
I have a next question here, which is very interesting. I don't know if we have the answer to it. It's from Diana Powers. Has the amount of methane been estimated from the underwater Nord Stream pipeline explosion and later from emissions closer to Russia? I think I had heard at some point that because it was underwater, maybe it was less damaging. Alessia, do you know this?
Well, I'm sure some of my colleagues could actually answer that better than I do. But it is actually difficult to know how much methane was actually emitted into the atmosphere. First, because we don't know how much from the pipeline actually leaked, but also how much made it into the atmosphere, because that would depend on the temperature of the water, of the microbial situation in this water. So there is a lot of factors that would explain the actual amount of methane that arrived in the atmosphere. What we know is that it's very likely one of the largest single events of methane emission in the atmosphere. However, we do need to keep in mind that that single event is what is emitted almost continually every day on methane across all the leagues on the world. So it is definitely a very impressive and very problematic emission accident that happened, incident maybe, and that should not overshadow otherwise the fact that these kind of leaks happen all the time, just in less spectacular way across a whole network.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Tomasz, at the IEA, do you have any estimation or idea about this?
We ourselves have not put together an estimate for this, but we have been seeing from people working with satellites that it was possible to estimate emissions. I believe it was something around 80,000 tons of methane being released. So it is really a major event. Normally, it is hard to detect methane emissions on water because of how satellites read the light signal. But when you have such major events, such big leaks, it becomes possible.
That is a huge amount, no matter what, for sure. But it's also sobering to know that that is roughly equal to the amount that we're emitting every day. Well, thank you to the panelists for some really interesting insight into domestic emissions. But a round of applause for our panelists. So we're now going to move on to the second panel, which is on methane emissions from imported oil and gas. So while we transition to that panel, have another look at the video explaining methane emissions.
Did you know that the fastest way to slow global warming is to reduce emissions from the gas methane? Methane is an invisible, odorless greenhouse gas, but it's powerful. And according to the IPCC, it's responsible for about 0.5 degrees of the global warming we've experienced to date. Methane traps 84 times more heat than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years that it's released into the air, and the amount of it in our atmosphere has been surging for the last 15 years. The faster the planet's temperatures rise, the more likely and the sooner we will see irreversible damage to our environment. So where does all this methane come from? 60% of the methane in our atmosphere comes from human activity, and the rest comes from natural sources like wetlands and permafrost melting. Methane from natural sources will keep rising while the planet heats up. But methane from human sources is preventable with the right public policies in place. Most methane pollution caused by human activity comes from fossil fuels, agriculture, and waste. 35% of methane comes from oil, gas, and coal. 32% of methane comes from animals raised for meat and dairy. 19% comes from waste, such as landfills and sewage. Another 8% comes from rice cultivation, and the rest comes from biomass burning, biogas production, and industry. A growing number of global leaders agree that cutting methane pollution is the fastest way to slow global warming. Fortunately, we have low-cost solutions to reduce methane emissions quickly in the next decade. More than 115 countries have signed on to the Global Methane Pledge, which aims to reduce global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And scientists say we can go even further to prevent a staggering 0.3 degrees of warming by 2040. The number might sound small, but the impact could be huge by preventing water shortages for millions, loss of food crops, increase in droughts, and much more. We cannot keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius without deep cuts to both methane and CO2. It is critical that policymakers around the world move quickly and aggressively to cut methane emissions now. Without immediate action, we won't meet the climate goals to reduce this powerful greenhouse gas and slow the rate of warming on our planet.
Okay, welcome back. So we're now transitioning over to panel 2, which is on international methane emissions, particularly from imported oil and gas into the EU. Let me introduce to you our second round of panelists. So we have Christian Lelong, Director of Climate Solutions at the Energy and Environmental Geoanalytics company Kairos. We have Flavia Solazzo, Senior Director for EU Energy Transition at the NGO, the Environmental Defense Fund. And we have Andres Piebalgs, Chair of the Implementation Committee of the International Methane Emissions Observatory of the United Nations Environment Program. Thank you all for joining us today. Christian, I'd like to start with a question for you. When we're looking at the methane emissions from imported oil and gas, what would you say is the best way for the EU to curtail those emissions?
I mean, I will start by saying that, Europe has invested a lot of resources in having, world-class tools to detect methane emissions. So starting with satellites, Sentinel-5P, Sentinel-2, and now the next generation of satellites like PRISMA and ENMAP. Europe has also invested a lot in all the analytics to analyze all these new sources of data. So for stopping or reducing imported emissions, I think there's several angles. One is the engaging directly with trade partners. We see a lot of emissions, for example, in Algerian gas fields. We see emissions, of course, in the US, in Central Asia. So the EU can work with those countries in a sort of partnership and put in place plans to reduce those emissions, whether it's from flaring or leaks or whatnot. I think the transparency angle is essential. If you only start using all these tools that I described to publish the imported emissions, whether you're bringing LNG from the Gulf of Mexico or pipeline gas from the Middle East or metallurgical coal from Australian coal mines, if that information is public, and we can do that with current tools, then the market will start to respond. Investors, consumers will start to draw and change their behavior. And lastly, the previous panel talked about regulating methane at the border. Whether that's going to happen now or a little bit later, we'll see, but we can say that putting a price on methane in the US is already having a visible impact. And we start to see already, a reduction in the methane intensity of oil and gas production in some parts of the US. So I think all these tools are available, the transparency, working with trade partners, and market mechanisms.
We'll come back to that US approach and how it might contrast with the EU approach a bit later. It's not just the pronunciation of methane that differs between Europe and the US, but also the approach currently. Flavia, let's turn to you next. What are you expecting from the EU approach, and what are you hoping for from the EU approach?
Yeah, well, I guess what we understand from the proposal as it is now being negotiated is that there are information requirements set for imports, and we see them, and they are a first step into understanding what the footprint of the supplies that are entering into the EU are. And together with IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, the EU will then develop a methane supply index. By 2025, at the latest, the Commission will analyze this data and propose how to strengthen those requirements. What will happen at that point is that we actually don't know. We don't know which policy instruments will be used. So I think that there are different options that could be feasible, and one is indeed to have a performance standard, as we've mentioned, and there is one that is being used now in the US, and putting a tax or a price on higher emissions. And another point that I think is quite relevant is, yes, we have we will have requirements in the EU. So we have requirements for monitoring, reporting, and verification. We have them for leak detection and repair. We will have them for venting and flaring. We need to somehow make sure that the gas supplies that come into the EU also meet those standards. And this is done in other commodities. It's done already for timber. It's done for agricultural products. It's done for cars, for chemicals. So I guess this is another option that then will be on the table.
Andres, we heard at the beginning about data, we saw those images of the gas being detected by the infrared cameras, and we know that accurate data about methane has been hard to come by, and that's been one of the problems in regulating it. How much data do we have on methane emissions right now? Is it enough to regulate? How much do we need to have a real true understanding of these emissions?
Well, basically we have data. We have estimations, we have factors, emission factors, we have also inventories. So we have data, and we can't claim that there is no data that prevent action. But I think improving data should create an action to mitigate the methane emissions, especially when in high price environment. You don't see that market takes it over, then you need to regulate. It's market failure you have in place. And if you start to regulate, you need very precise data, so based on measurements. So I think that's the first pillar that definitely need to develop. The second pillar is there are many companies involved. This OGMP 2.0 by mass already today represents 1/3 of producers. There are also pipeline companies, LNG companies, and there is also storage operators. Not huge amount of them, 10, 15%, but still it creates a basis for methodology, but it's also makes data for industry to make action. They are accountable also for their shareholders. And that, I think, is another pillar. And third pillar is definitely new technologies that are being developed, particularly satellites, and all these images that we talked about, methane alert and response system. It sounds very dramatic, but actually it is also data, because you see plume of methane emissions, you measure what is the size, perhaps it's super emitter, you localize it, and then you take an action really to deal with this. So in this way, data creates a new environment. And IMEO tries really to push the boundaries with OGMP 2.0, with Mars, but also with training of officials, with trying to get more broader basis. Because I have been in methane, I would say, human landscape for some while, and there is a limited number of people that are in it. So if it's regulated, we need more people with good knowledges, on data, how you aggregate data, etc. So IMEO definitely plays a key role, and actually 2 years since its creation, it has advanced quite well on this data.
So we know that we have a different menu of approaches when it comes to dealing with methane. We have different menu of technological approaches, technological solutions. We have a different menu of policy solutions, policy approaches. Christian, as we look at that menu of possibilities, what, in your estimation, is the smartest way to go? Does it differ based on geography? Is maybe something suited for one part of the world, not suited for another part of the world? What's your recommendation in terms of approaches?
Yes, I think we can start to be a bit more prescriptive now, because we now have about 3 years worth of satellite data, and we see clearly differences between regions. So the ones that would be high on my list would be gas pipelines. Europe has lots of gas pipelines, and when we look at super emitters, the map in Europe is all dark, meaning there's barely anything to see. And then we see the gas transport network in Russia, in the US or in Canada and other countries, and we see these super emitters coming time and again. And this is down to how they operate those pipelines. When they do maintenance, they open valves, they flush 20 kilometers of pipeline. In Europe, that is not done because that's not the regulation. So that's a really easy one. Another one is, in coal mining. Europe still imports metallurgical coal for steel and will continue to do so for a while. The mining industry knows how to drain methane from coal mines before the coal is exposed. They do it for safety reasons, so it would be great if they did it for environmental reasons as well. And then, venting and flaring are twin problems that are well known. We still see a lot of flaring activity in the world. Where there is flaring, there is usually venting. And again, it would be great to nip those two at the same time. So those would be three at the top of my list.
Flavia, what do you think is the best approach, in particular for Europe?
Well, I would say that there is no silver bullet. No, there is an integration of approaches also, as Christian was mentioning, and I think at the beginning we need a robust MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification. And we can do that in different ways. So we have the satellite part and the airborne part, where we can see the concentration. We can see where the emissions are located, and then we have the on-site part where we can then go into the mitigation actions and detect the leaks and repair them. So I guess there is this part, and then the other part is indeed the economic approaches and to see, okay, this is what we have, this is what we can do about it, and as I was mentioning, there are different parts. You can go through contracts, you can go through joint purchase agreements, you can go through performance standards, for example.
The data shows us, as we've seen, that there's differences between geographies in terms of how methane emissions come, and then who the big players are, as you were putting it, in terms of methane emitters. So what do you think is the best approach for Europe, given Europe's particular situation?
No, I think Europe is clearly should play an important role on importing oil and gas, and transparency and economic incentives in importing cleaner or more environmentally more friendly oil and gas, and giving incentives to producers really to save emissions, because then they also could sell better to the Europe. I think that is very specific to Europe. It's not only Europe. I would mention also Japan could do the same also for China. So there are a couple of very big players in the market that definitely could influence. And for this reason, EU legislation without addressing imports would be just not very serious approach to the issue, because in this way we would save peanuts, and at the same time we would have missed major opportunity in influencing global thinking, global approach. And with global methane pledge, it is even, it must be done. It just must be done. There is no option to go out of it.
In terms of imports, we heard earlier from Thomas's presentation, we could see on the chart that Europe's methane footprint goes way beyond its borders because of the imports. Because Thomas said that the EU is striking deals on fossil fuel imports with countries that have not signed the pledge, the global methane emissions pledge. Christian, does a really radical rethink here of trade policy need to happen if you're having the EU sign this pledge in Glasgow and then going on and making deals with countries that aren't in it? There seems to be a disconnect there, no?
Yes, to go back to the data that Thomas showed, 10 million tons of imported methane emissions, times 80, which is the strength of methane, that's the carbon footprint of the German economy. So if we could cut that in half, which, I guess most people would agree is feasible, that's huge. And you have to work with countries that have signed the pledge as well as those that haven't. And again, I think now that IMEO is becoming operational, we can all have this common data set to agree on, yes, self-reported numbers, again, as Thomas showed, have underreported true emissions in the fossil fuel supply chain by probably an order of magnitude. So let's agree on the data and start measuring how these, the methane content of the fossil fuels we import is going down in a verifiable manner.
Flavia, do you also think that the EU should be working with countries that haven't signed the pledge, or would you like to see a trade policy that says nope, no pledge, no imports?
Well, we are at more than 150 now, and I think one of the big outcomes of COP27 in terms of methane emissions was the joint declaration between importers and exporters, even though it's an announcement. But I think it is something that can start making the difference. And And the other point I would like to mention is something that was mentioned earlier. So the RePowerEU and the initiative You Collect, We Buy that was mentioned there, but then didn't really find traction, because this is something that needs input. It needs money to be put into the infrastructure that is already existing to make sure that the gas that is already extracted from the soil is then also used and not just wasted in the atmosphere. And I think there are different ways of tackling it. Yes, sure, countries that have signed the global methane pledge, but then also countries that agree to these kind of things. And I think this is a broader picture in terms of the transition that we have to put, that we have to address.
One more question for you guys before I go to the audience questions. So again, put in your questions on Slido. They'll pop up here and I can ask them to the panelists. But I want to compare and contrast with the US approach. So Andres, you first. This approach we were talking about before with the price, we see, I think in particular when we're talking about imports, that could be quite interesting. What do you think? Who's got the right approach here? The US with the price or the EU with maybe not a price?
No, I think US is doing right. No question about it. Politically, could we do more? I doubt. Yeah, so I think in the regulations proposed, the lowest common denominator that could go through, not trying to provoke too much opposition to the whole regulation. So definitely it's right. And indirectly, we will be in this debate, because European Parliament has voted in its position on CBAM to include hydrogen and ammonia. If you look on these two commodities, they are related to the natural gas. So that means that methane is already in. So, and CBAM, okay, the testing phase, first they need also to adopt, yeah, but there is already this direction. I don't know what Parliament's arguments have been this, but they voted in a huge majority for this, and they, I think, are aware that it involves also methane costs in a way, because you need to transfer them, you need to have calculation, how much does it will influence imported hydrogen, based on the natural gas, and the same also with ammonia. So there is already opening for the discussion on fees.
So it's possible that we get a price on methane by stealth?
Yeah, we get through the CBAM. If it is involved, you can't say, well, this is only CO2 emissions. You need to take all greenhouse gas emissions, so methane is in. I don't know how much Parliament was aware when they voted, but I assume they have been aware, because otherwise they have not been voted it in. So that is in. Council should agree or disagree, but it would be very difficult to disagree, particularly for ammonia. But if you agree for ammonia, then you can't not agree for hydrogen. So you are in.
Well, nobody tell the MEPs that they figured this out.
Well, they are clever enough.
Christian, in terms of contrasting the US approach to the US approach, what do you think? What's going to be the story there as we go ahead?
I mean, what we've seen with the IRA in the US is that it has sharpened a lot of people's minds. And to take an example that, you know, your colleagues at EDF highlighted some time ago, there was this gas compressor station in Texas, and it was malfunctioning. And, you know, your colleagues saw it, we saw it as well. We talked about it, and, you know, nothing much happened. Now with IRA, with a $900 a ton price on methane, we use the same example and say, this facility, over 1 week, it would have incurred $2 million in penalties. And the leak was actually longer than that, so you're talking tens of millions in potential penalties. That sharpens, you know, people's minds, whether it's the company concerned or their shareholders. So I think it's that really nice thing about, you know, bringing the topic of mitigation to dollars and cents, and that for me has been the greatest thing about the IRA.
Flavia, what do you think in terms of these IRA provisions on methane? How are they going to affect the debate here in Europe?
Well, I completely agree with with the two of them, and I also think it's what is agreed in the US and what is going to be implemented there. is based on actual numbers that the industry has already agreed to through the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, and some of the things we are negotiating in the EU are based on what the industry has already agreed on the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, and so I guess it's a kind of a no-brainer because it's things that the industry can already do. So I guess it needs to affect what we do here as well.
Well, let me take a question from the audience. It's also related to the U.S. Christian, I'll put it to you. The question is from Sophie Marandon from FIPRA. Advanced solutions exist to monitor methane emissions continuously at low costs. We're seeing that the U.S. is working on an EPA regulation that would encourage continuous monitoring and repair at oil and gas facilities. Could you see this happening in the EU?
Yeah, there's no reason why not. And again, what the US is doing is interesting because it is a bit of a laboratory. One of my favorite clauses in the IRA is what is called the empirical clause. The EPA is saying, we know the way we've measured methane in the past is not accurate. We know the companies are clearly underreporting. We need to do better. We know there's new technologies out there, but we just haven't figured out exactly what's the ideal monitoring system of the future. They know that it needs to include more and more observations. And so that will include around-the-clock monitoring from local ground sensors. It will include airplanes. It will include drones. And it will include different types of satellites. And I think, the US has given itself a bit of a year and a half to flesh out what they meant by empirical data to implement the IRA.
Flavia, what do you think about this idea of continuous monitoring?
Well, again, I have to agree in the sense that it's something that is indeed feasible, and the point is also that the sooner we find the leaks, the faster we address it, and yeah. So I think there is nothing that speaks against if we are honest.
Andres, would you agree?
Well, it would be difficult to disagree, but it is always that we need to think how technology evolves, because technology evolved enormously, costs have dropped down, and broader application definitely perhaps will take this argument that costs increases immensely because, well, technologies are there and these are not the most expensive technologies. So it's really can be applied, and it's not for huge expense for consumers, because if these technologies are addressed broadly, then is there more gas is being saved. That means that we have more supply to the market, and the prices for consumers drop. So there is Executive Vice President Timmermans elegantly spoke that sometimes in the argumentation there is a tendency to hide because behind the smallest part of consumers or producers to make that it is impossible to make, and the biggest ones are behind it. Just, why they don't do this? Because they just, they don't like it. So that's as simple as that. So there is no actually reason. So definitely this continuous monitoring makes sense, and it's not too expensive if you look about the costs in the lifetime.
Well, the next question comes from Megan Richards. So this is about looking at the difference in methane emissions if you're comparing pipeline gas to LNG gas shipped across the ocean. There are some studies indicating that Russian pipeline gas has 2 to 3 times the greenhouse gas emissions of shipped LNG from the US. Is this possible given the relatively small amounts of gas sent per ship versus piped gas? Is there a reliable measure that compares all GHG emissions per BCM of LNG versus piped gas? Christian, what is the difference in terms of methane emissions from imports when you're looking at LNG versus pipeline gas?
I mean, I think the biggest difference is the way the gas was produced in the first place. And that's going to account for the bulk of the methane emissions from the consumer perspective. LNG tankers may leak a tiny bit, but I think that's very small, and we cannot measure it anyway. Pipelines, again, they can be more or less wasteful depending on how they do maintenance and where do they see super emitters. To the question of was Russian gas dirtier than LNG or not, it depends on which LNG provider you're comparing it to. So I would say not necessarily. Norwegian LNG, yes, I'm sure much cleaner than Russian gas. LNG from some other countries, probably dirtier than Russian pipeline gas.
So it's really not about the method of shipping the gas, it's about where that gas was coming from and how it was came out of the earth. If we're comparing, I mean, on that same subject, if we're looking at, let's say, shale gas from the US versus Russian gas coming from Siberia versus Norwegian gas, do we have a good comparative analysis of the methane emissions, if you're looking at imports to Europe, that can reliably let policymakers know this is better, that's better? Flavia?
Well, I guess this goes back to the fact that monitoring, reporting, and verification is key in all over, and I think this doesn't mean that we have to stop until we have relevant data or reliable data. But I think we need to make sure that whatever imports we bring into the EU have the lowest methane emissions as possible, and we don't want to risk that we import from somewhere where we don't meet the requirements that we have here, but also where we risk to jeopardize the targets that we've set.
Andres, do you think we can make reliable comparisons?
I think we need to make. A Commission had this ambition to create a methane supply index. And IMEO, partially was bounded to support this process, really to have a better measurement and calculation methods and to provide this. How it should be used, I am not saying that it will be used for commercial operation, because at the end of the day, there is declaration about your greenhouse gas emissions, and if there will be fee, it will be on individual declaration based. But for transparency, it makes a huge difference if you can say methane supply index from US is this, methane supply index from Algeria is different, because it influences domestic producer. It definitely influences. You don't want to be in the situation where you are compared with your peers, and that definitely makes a lot of difference.
And if I can just add to that, so with satellite data, we look at methane in two levels. The first level is what we call super emitters. So these are really big plumes of methane that stand out against the background, and they usually are tied to a specific facility that was venting or leaking. And we can compare different countries to see how many of these super emitters do we see in the upstream sector, in the production of oil and gas, and keeping in mind the amount of fossil fuels they are producing. But there's another use of satellite data. The technical term is inversion models. So here we're looking at the cloud of methane across an entire oil and gas field or a coal basin, average over the month, average over the year, and that's meant to reflect all the sources of methane, big or small, across that entire region. And so that really gives you a good sense of the actual kilograms of methane emitted per barrel of oil equivalent produced, and that's a great basis to compare different producers, whether you're looking at shale gas in the Permian Basin versus Algerian gas from Hassi Ahmed, from other basins around the world. And again, that I'm sure will be another of the inputs.
Yeah, because Mars actually is being, that's first for next year, it is really for point sources of emissions, so very much. But generally later it would go in this direction. So it will be, we will have better data, better satellites, and we could be very sure what we are saying, that these are verified data. It's not something that estimates, it is measurement based. So that is intention of the Mars.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to get a quick concluding thought from each of you in terms of what we we have, the legislators in the Parliament and the Council are going to be considering this proposal in the coming months. What is the number one thing you would want to tell them to make sure that they understand as they're considering this in the next months? What do you think is most important, particularly what's maybe not understood? Christian?
So my key message should be, the data and the technologies to start reducing emissions significantly are already available today. And the technology, I think, is going to have about 3 years ahead of policy, because with the data we have, which is not complete, but it already highlights the biggest emitters, let's get rid of those. It will take a couple of years. By that time, we'll have the next generation of satellites and sensors and algorithms, and we'll be able to see, the next batch of sources to eliminate, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be an iterative process, but bottom line, we have enough data to really take a big step towards the 30% reduction of the methane pledge.
Flavia?
Yeah, I can only second that, and I would like to add that yes, so we have the technology, we have sufficient data, and what I think is important is that we make sure that we don't favor the difficulties that are put on the table by some of the companies in the EU at the moment, which can be overcome by the technology that is there at the expenses of the future energy security and at the expenses of the climate.
And Andres?
Well, it's always risky to make any advice to legislators, but I believe in case of doubt, ask experts. We have excellent experts for satellites. We have excellent experts. Thomas demonstrated on the ground measurements. We have excellent experts, and they will say why exactly this provision is needed. So trust the text, but trust also the experts. We have excellent expertise, and it's not prejudged expertise. It's really objective on the facts. So that I would advise them in this critical phase to quickly find agreement on basis of science. It's not so much just regulation for administrative purposes, but it's also based on scientific facts.
Well, I want to thank the panelists very much for some really interesting insights. I'll put a round of applause for them. And you guys can stick around here for just a moment. We're next going to be getting our wrapping up remarks. I think so far we've really heard that the data is there enough to legislate. The policy expertise is there. The question is whether there's the will to move. I think one particular thing that we've figured out so far is that the U.S., in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is effectively the first climate bill the U.S. has ever passed, has gone pretty far here and has gone quite a bit further than the EU is even intending to go with its proposal. That doesn't happen every day. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic when the legislators in the Parliament and the Council look at this, and they're looking at what's happening over in the US perhaps for inspiration. It's not something we're used to seeing for climate legislation. That will make for an interesting dynamic. But I'd next like to pass over the floor for some concluding remarks to Malcolm McDowell. Now, Malcolm is from the European Commission's Energy Department, is in charge of the Commission's methane strategy. He's been listening to everything we've had to say here, and we're going to get some responses from him. So, Malcolm, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking Clean Air Task Force for organizing this. And they were nice enough also not only to invite me, but to allow me to take the last spot. Now I'm reflecting back on this and thinking, note to self, don't do that again. You're just going to be frustrated for 2 hours. You'll want to react to everything you're hearing and not get the chance until the end. And I'll no doubt forget everything that I wanted to say, but I'll do my best to come back on some of those major points. I also want to thank Clean Air Task Force because it's taken this proposal very seriously and is very engaged, and we appreciate that because what is important in this particular policy proposal is to achieve, I think, the kind of ambition that only comprehensive involvement from the different stakeholders will deliver. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's so important in a moment. But I want to begin with emphasizing one thing that some of the presentations today hinted at, but I wish there would have been a little bit more drama around it to really emphasize the situation that we're in right now with regards to methane emissions, whether it's in the energy sector indeed or elsewhere. We just don't have a clue how much anthropogenic methane emissions are being emitted. We don't know the sources of that methane emissions, the reasons for it, and we have sure as hell no idea of the magnitude. All those numbers you saw are misleading because most of those numbers, especially as Professor Ruckman said, those based on the national inventories are based on estimations, not direct measurements. In fact, we have reason to believe the oil and gas industry and the coal industry themselves don't know. Some of them have signed up some voluntary agreements recently to make good on their methane emissions. I think a lot of it is paying lip service to the fact that in the minds of legislators, methane emissions has become important. Whether they're really having a grip on the methane emissions they're responsible for is another thing. And we're not completely sure about that. But certainly, we want to try to impose on them the kind of obligations that will ensure that they soon have knowledge of their methane emission problem. And so the first thing that we thought we needed to start with, but not the only thing, is to impose a high standard of measurement and reporting and verification, which is not actually completely taken from thin air, because for oil and gas, it's true that there is a good voluntary initiative, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. And what we found appealing about it is that it's striving towards ensuring for all the kind of methane emission sources for which it's possible to deliver direct measurements. And also to have the source level measurements verified against site level measurements. And indeed, that's exactly what we've put into our legislation. But we also recognize that even though you don't have a good understanding of the methane emissions problem, you can already come up with abatement measures. Many of you have alluded to the fact that some of these in the energy sector in particular are cost effective. Indeed, it's true. And there are well-recognized, in the oil and gas sectors, well-recognized means of first of all, growing an understanding on the kind of fugitive emissions that you have, and repairing them, and also there are means of restricting venting and flaring to ensure that you're emitting as little as possible. To come back, and I'm doing it now already because I'm not even looking at my notes, come back again on numbers. I wanted to say something about some of the methane intensity numbers that you're talking about, that you talked about, Professor Ruckmans. I think the US, you mentioned some 3 or 4% methane intensity on the basis of estimates. I heard from experts in the field that in the US it could be as high as 9% for fossil gas, in fact, especially in the Permian Basin. And the IEA didn't say it tonight, but they made a calculation that actually beyond 4% of methane losses, you're talking about a form of energy that's worse than coal. So this is what we're talking about with regards to fossil gas specifically. So imagine if the industry isn't getting it right in terms of ensuring ambition in this regulation, how will they convince you? You spoke, Andres, about ammonia and hydrogen, some of which is made from natural gas. And the industry is telling us, that same industry that doesn't know about its methane emissions problem is telling us that it can produce low greenhouse gas intensity hydrogen, for instance. Well, I would say that if we don't have an ambitious regulation through which they will demonstrate in a few years that they've controlled their methane emissions, they will never be able to produce that low greenhouse gas intensity hydrogen. And I doubt very much that they can today. Part of the problem is also that there is no certification scheme or any authority right now in the world that could attest to the methane intensity of those operators. I have to complain a little bit about what I've been hearing tonight, because I wish we would have focused a little bit more on the abatement measures that we put on the table. It's all good and well to reflect on what the US has done, but it's not what we put on the table. And I'll explain to you why it's not even a good idea as far as I'm concerned. What we put on the table, and that is being discussed right now, has been discussed since the beginning of the year in the Council, are very detailed prescriptive measures on LDAR and restrictions on venting and flaring. These are the things I would have liked to have heard views pronounced on a bit more. I mean, thinking about the whole idea behind the tax, as per the ETS, by the way, is that you're willing to accept emissions of greenhouse gases being legally emitted into the atmosphere in return for a certain amount of money to do so. This is not the approach we want to take with this regulation. We want to restrict as much as possible methane emissions in the atmosphere. And then what about a level of a tax? The US tax begins at $900 per ton. UNEP last year calculated that the cost on society of methane being emitted rather than abated is $4,300 US. Are we getting it right? Is the US getting it right? What about spending that money, instead of spending it for the opportunity to emit, what about spending that money, a lot less of it, towards actually abating methane emissions, knowing that most of them pay for themselves? And is it the right approach? I wonder. Not to mention the fact that you have to talk about it in the context of the EU. Tax means unanimity. It's a non-starter. So all these things I want to say about that. Then I will finish by talking a little bit about what you said about how we should regulate importers. No one actually talked about what's inside that proposal with regards to importers. What we're proposing to do, which we think is not only the simplest way to do it, but also in many respects a very effective way, the man from Kairos actually highlighted it, is to put the spotlight on what is being done and what is not being done with regards to methane emissions regulations, but also actions from companies around the world, and put that in a database where everyone will have free and publicly available access to it. It might even start with just highlighting which of the member states that have signed up to the Paris Agreement are actually delivering those commitments. It'll talk about whether, if they're delivering inventories, whether they're actually even delivering it at the highest possible level, which is itself not that ambitious, because it's still emission factors and not direct measurements. It could highlight whether the regulations that have been put in place are leading to changes that are verifiable changes, independently verifiable changes in terms of methane emissions. It could put a lot of information on all the different exporters to the EU of fossil gas, of oil or coal. And on that basis, we've allowed ourselves also to review what we managed to get with all this requirement, which will be a requirement on importers to gather all this information. And then in 2025, we can review and consider what else we could do. But part of the proposal, which is outside of the proposal, but that needs to be taken into account, that can't be ignored, is all the efforts that we've been doing, the Commission, together with the External Action Service, to have things on the table like the Global Methane Pledge. We delivered that. We also delivered the joint declaration with the EU, US, Japan, Canada and others, and that's no mean feat. Why? Because we got them in this joint declaration to sign up to the same kind of ambitious domestic measures in their own domestic regulations. So what I'm telling you today is that the approach that we took is one that still believes in climate diplomacy, that it can deliver. And even then, if it doesn't deliver in a few years' time, we allow ourselves to review and decide on what we could be doing. But what we would be doing then, I very much doubt it, but we'll see, very much doubt that it will be anything like a tax. I think now we've understood enough about methane emissions to realize that this is not about providing permits to pollute. This is about really abating methane emissions to the fullest extent. And that will be my last word on that.
Thanks, Malcolm. And finally, for our concluding remarks, I'd like to hand it back over to Jonathan Banks from the Clean Air Task Force to give us some reflections on what we've heard tonight.
And Malcolm, you knew I wouldn't let you have the last word. always be the last one at the podium. I'm not going to take up, I think I was given 10 minutes for this. I'm not going to take up 10 minutes, don't worry, because I know I'm standing between you all and the wine that's out there. I wanted to touch on it. There was a lot that we have discussed today, and I wanted to touch on a couple of things just to reflect. And unfortunately, a lot of them are from the back end of the session here, rather than from the front end. But I wanted to first, there was a question I think you asked. If all of this stuff is so profitable, why aren't companies doing this? And I think one of the things that we missed in that discussion is that cost curves are really great for identifying how much it costs to actually do a mitigation measure versus how much savings you get from conserving that gas and being able to sell that gas. They are not very good for saying why it's not happening. The reason that it's not happening is quite varied from company to company, country to country. There are things that we refer to as barriers in the system. And there are barriers in the system that prevent companies from taking action on this. Barriers that are often overcome only through the regulatory process. I'll give you an example of one. Within a company, you can have a company that has a division within the company that's drilling wells. And you can have a division within the company that is supposed to mitigate methane emissions. Those two divisions in the company have to fight for the same amount of capital within the company. And they have to show a rate of return on investment. And the part of the company that drills the well has a higher rate of return than the part of the company that mitigates methane. They're always going to lose out to the guys that want to drill wells. That's just how companies work. They have to make the most profit from what they have. You put regulations in place, the game changes completely because now the people in the methane division have the primary status, and that changes everything. That's just one example of barriers. I can give you a list of 1,000 barriers that vary from country to country around the world. But we have to find ways to start overcoming those barriers. And the only thing that we have found that overcomes barriers is direct regulation. I also want to talk a little bit about the U.S. piece because I think there's a bit of a misconception of what the U.S. actually did. The U.S. put in place a fee on methane emissions. That is correct. But it is not by itself. The fee is in place along with direct regulations. The fee was put into place in the U.S. for two very important reasons. One, to accelerate action. They recognize that we have a very cumbersome regulatory structure in the United States. It takes a long time for anything to move through it. They could put a fee in place that would actually cause action by companies much more rapidly than the regulations that will be coming down the pipe later on. And the second reason is, back to our cumbersome regulatory environment, the United States EPA, our regulatory body, doesn't have authority over offshore oil and gas and a number of other sections of the oil and gas system. The fee is also designed to expand the scope of our methane actions. And so it actually, as time goes on, you will see it targeting, it will be able to target the offshore sector, the LNG export terminals, things that EPA currently can't regulate. And so it's important to understand that this is a layered approach. It was not a unique, oh, we're just going to do the fee thing. It's a layered approach to expand the scope. And so when we're looking at examples for how this might work for Europe and things like that, it's an important piece to look at, but it's also important to understand the context with which the U.S. has been using this. The other piece I wanted to just briefly mention was, and Malcolm referred to this a little bit as well, the issues around we've talked a lot about data and the importance of data, and data is critically important. And we'll be seeing so much more improvement in what we can see both domestically within the EU as well as internationally from other countries. But it's important to understand that precise data is not necessary to do what we need to start doing. And we're not going to get methane regulations perfect on the first try. Because data is not perfect. But we can write regulations today, and Malcolm, you've already done this. We can write regulations today that take on this question of data from a perspective of, look, we don't really need data to implement LDAR. We don't really need data to say, you know what, if you have a piece of equipment that's designed to leak methane, literally designed to leak methane, replace it with something that doesn't. That doesn't take data. That's just a standard you put in place. There are a number of different things throughout the system that we can put in place that do those kinds of things that require no data and will improve our data as we implement them. The other thing to note on the data piece, because we were talking about the LNG import pathways and things like that, it is it's really difficult right now to say, a country has an emission rate of X, 5% or whatever. You can't do that. You look at the U.S., you wouldn't say the U.S. has a 9% emission rate. You would say the Permian Basin has a 9% emission rate. But maybe what you really need to be doing is looking at the company level, because even within the Permian, you're going to see differences by the companies. When we did an analysis in the U.S., we found vast differences between emission rates from companies and their operations in certain basins versus other basins. So as we move to looking at how to evaluate emissions coming into Europe, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're going to need a much better way to understand how this looks going forward. What was done in the United States on the methane fee, again, not to address imported emissions, was they said, all right, let's make an assumption about what you emit. If you don't agree with that assumption, then come to us with data and prove that we are wrong. And so that's a way that they've gotten around the data question that can be something to be looked at as we move forward here. Those are a couple of things I wanted to flag. I also just wanted to go back to something that Executive Vice President Timmermans mentioned as well, that we're having this conversation about mostly oil and gas, and I think we've mentioned coal maybe 3 times. Sorry, there was a couple of guys in the room here from the coal side that wanted to talk coal, but we also really, as Executive Vice President Timmermans said, we also really need to start looking at how to mitigate methane emissions with the waste sector, the ag sector, and I'm really excited to hear some of the things that the Vice President mentioned about exploring the funding mechanisms as well as research and other regulatory measures to begin to address methane in the ag sector. And then, of course, we have 2 provisions coming up next year to look at waste from landfills as well as waste from the whole waste cycle. So we have to start talking a lot more about that stuff, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world, because the temperature benefit that we get from mitigating methane emissions, the 0.3 degrees Celsius change that we can get through mitigating methane emissions doesn't come just from the oil and gas sector. We have to start addressing the other sectors as well. With that, I will no longer stand in the way of you and your glass of wine. And I thank you all for joining us here tonight, and wish you all a good night. And hopefully we can find a TV to turn the matches on. So, cheers.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, I will extend my invitation as well out for the drinks. And just to let you know, if you're watching online or here in person, you can find the video of tonight's events on the Euractiv webpage in the future. Thanks, and have a great evening.